Now that we've discussed the role of respiratory pigments and blood, we can turn our attention to the pressure-driven bulk convective movement of fluid in the circulatory system of animals. Circulatory systems play a crucial role in the distribution of gases, nutrients, and wastes through the body of animals. They're also very important for regulating the distribution of heat and also doing pressure-driven work by blood pressure, such as driving glomerular filtration in the kidney. Remember that diffusion only works down to distances about less than 1 millimeter. Above that, we need the bulk convective flow of fluid to move things around. Here's a nice micrograph of red blood cells in the smallest vessels, the capillaries. These are very thin-walled, as you can see, and red blood cells line up one by one to go through these smallest types of blood vessels. I wonder if you can tell what type of animal these blood cells must come from. The characteristic to notice is that these red blood cells have no nuclei, and that's only found in mammals. This is a diagram of a typical teleost or bony fish heart. The heart has 4 identifiable chambers that run in a series. The sinus venosus receives blood from the systemic circulation. The blood then flows into an atrium, which is contractile, and fills the ventricle. The ventricle is much more muscular, and when it contracts, blood is pushed into the bulbus arteriosus, which then feeds into the circulation heading towards the gills. Note that there are valves between the sinus venosus and the atrium, between the atrium and the ventricle, and between the bulbus arteriosus and the ventricle. These prevent backflow, so flow is in one direction. The inner wall of the myocardial muscle of the ventricle is spongy. This allows for increased gas exchange with the ventricular muscle. Some types of bony fish have a separate coronary circulation and some compact myocardium. In this case, blood vessels carrying oxygenated blood from the gills return back to the heart ventricle and supply this compact myocardium with additional oxygen. High-performance fish, such as salmon, have this hybrid coronary blood flow, where they have some spongy myocardium and some compact myocardium. And the amount of compact myocardium is correlated with migration distance. So you can see in this figure that longer distance migrant salmon have a higher percentage of compact myocardium. This is correlated with the increased aerobic swimming performance that's required for such long migrations. Amphibians, as well as the non-crocodilian reptiles, turtles, lizards, and snakes, have a 3-chambered heart that does not completely separate systemic and pulmonary circuits. The hearts in these animals have 2 atria, which completely separate the systemic and pulmonary blood flows. However, they have a single ventricle where there can be some mixing of the blood. However, in amphibians, there's a structure called the spiral fold, which mostly diverts the flow from each circuit to the right place. In reptiles, there's a partial septum or piece of tissue that partially separates the ventricle into 2 areas that also diverts flow more or less into the right direction. Thus, all of these animals have a high-pressure systemic loop and a low-pressure pulmonary loop. In amphibians, deoxygenated blood leaves the right side of the heart and flows either through the lungs where it gets oxygenated, or coming off the same loop is a diversion that goes to the skin where oxygen is picked up and CO2 is released. Blood returning from the lungs enters the left side of the heart at the left atrium. However, the oxygenated blood returning from the skin does not return directly to the left side of the heart. Instead, it actually re-enters the returning systemic circulation, which is mostly deoxygenated. So this partially oxygenated blood then returns to the right heart and can further go back to the lungs. Things are a bit different in reptiles. Blood leaving the right ventricle goes to the lungs, gets oxygenated, and returns to the left side of the heart, where it's then pumped to the systemic circulation. If there's gas exchange at the skin, this comes off the systemic circulation. So you can see in the right-hand figure that in some species the skin can re-oxygenate some blood, but this blood then returns to the systemic circulation, returning to the right heart. Many times invertebrates have accessory hearts, meaning they have more than one heart. Cephalopods, like squid and octopi, are very active mollusks, and they have closed circulatory systems. Their systemic blood returns from the body and splits to feed two branchial hearts, which pump blood through the two gills. Blood coming out of the gills returns to a systemic heart, which then pumps blood through an aorta to go back to the systemic circulation. You might wonder in this diagram why the oxygenated blood is blue. Remember that cephalopods are mollusks that have hemocyanin in their blood. This copper-rich respiratory pigment actually turns blue when it becomes oxygenated. Most other invertebrates have what are termed open circulatory systems. Hemolymph, or blood, is pumped by a heart or multiple hearts and travels in vessels through some of the circulatory system, but then fills large sinuses, or open spaces that directly bathe the organs and muscles. Here's a demonstration of the open circulatory system of a spider. A radio-opaque tracer was injected into the artery of the spider, and then under an X-ray, you can see how initially most of the tracer is in a large blood vessel. It travels down to smaller blood vessels, but then just kind of diffuses out into the open sinuses of the open circulatory system. The continual pumping by the hearts pressurizes the sinuses, pushing the hemolymph back to eventually return and fill the heart. The hearts of invertebrates come in many types. In crustaceans like the crayfish and lobster that you studied in lab, there is a discrete single-chambered heart that is suspended by ligaments in a hemolymph-filled sinus called the pericardial sinus. Valves called ostia on the outside of the heart open on expansion to allow it to fill with hemolymph. When the heart contracts, the ostia close, and the blood is forced to eject out the anterior and posterior arteries that supply the systemic circulation. This heart relies on elastic rebound of the ligaments to fill it back up. These are diagrams of the circulatory system of a typical decapod crustacean like the crayfish. These animals have an extensive arterial network and some capillary beds. You can see how blood leaves the heart in the anterior and posterior direction through arteries, which then flow out to either the head area or the tail area and open up into sinuses. There's also an accessory heart called the cor frontale, which increases blood pressure and flow into the brain. Hemolymph returns through the gills at very low pressure, and then into the pericardial sinus where it's picked up by the heart and repumped out. You might think that having an open circulatory system is very ineffective or very inefficient, but this is not necessarily the case. Open circulatory systems can be comparable in performance in terms of O2 delivery and flow rate to closed systems of other ectotherms, and this is mainly because resistance is very low. This table compares a variety of circulatory functions between a spiny lobster, a rock crab, and two types of fish, starry flounder and a rainbow trout. You can see that the rates of O2 delivery are actually pretty comparable among them. The rate of blood flow is actually very much higher in the crab and lobster than the flounder and trout. The most important difference is the systemic resistance, which is the resistance to flow through the system. And you can see it can be anywhere from 25% to 10% in the invertebrates compared to the fish. It's a bit surprising to see that the heart rate in a lobster or a crab is actually much higher or comparable to what you see in fish. Insects achieve high performance for flight with an open circulatory system because gases are not transported through the circulatory system. They're transported through the tracheal system. The circulation is used for the transport of fuels and wastes. This is a schematic diagram of the circulatory system of a locust. There is a dorsal aorta with many peristaltic hearts that contract all along the aorta. The hemolymph generally flows from the posterior to the anterior and drains into open sinuses before it returns back into the aorta to be pumped again.